A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, we're turning our attention to religious instruction in schools, or SRE in some states, called Special Religious Education. And you know what? There are some threats that you may want to be aware of. Well, Christian social commentator David Robertson is back with us. David is a writer for newspapers, magazines. He's the author of a number of books, including The Dawkins Letters and Engaging with Atheists. His latest book is called Seek, and these days he's a minister of the gospel at Scots Kirk Presbyterian Church in Newcastle in New South Wales, where we're talking to him from today. Hey David, welcome back to 2020.
Nice to be back with you on this beautiful, sunny summer's, 10-degree Scottish summer's day in Newcastle.
Yes, it's like summer's day for a Scotsman. Hey, Dave, Let's talk about religious education, special religious education, SRE. Some states call it RE, some call it RI, all sorts of different ways, but it's about Christianity being taught in schools, in whatever dimension that might be. And someone might even say, well, why is that important? If people have some sort of a choice, why is it such an important thing to talk about? What's your response?
Well, I think, just to say, from an outsider's point of view, in the sense that obviously you can gather by my accents, I'm not from around here. I was astounded when I came to New South Wales to discover that the government permitted or even encouraged scripture education. Now, it is voluntary. In other words, it's not a compulsory part of the curriculum, and parents have to sign their children up for it. It doesn't exist in every state in Australia, for example. It doesn't exist in Victoria. But I think it's a wonderful thing that schools facilitate the opportunity for children to learn scripture. And it's a tremendous gift, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And I think it's under particular threat at the moment, which is why I wanted to discuss it.
And you know, if we were reflecting on our Australian history, well, scripture education's been a part of the curriculum ever since day dot, because the first schools were established by the first chaplain from the First Fleet. And so ever since then, right through the development of what would have been Anglican schools and then, of course, Catholic education, scripture has been a part of it all the way through. So it's not surprising that it has been a part of the education curriculum for students right throughout our history. What might be a challenge is that there are some states that are regulating it out of the curriculum. But even hearing from you and your reflection, you were surprised to see that it was in there in the first place. So this is something we could reflect on as being a very good part of our history, isn't it?
Yeah, and you don't appreciate it until you lose it. And I think there are two particular threats to it. One is, in order for it to happen, you need volunteers. You need people willing to teach. Plus, when it shifted from being that pupils opted out of it to having to opt in, obviously the numbers have dropped considerably, and churches need to encourage people to sign up for this. There is a difference between what I would call religious education, which is education about religions, not just Christianity, and what I would call scripture education, which is looking at things from a scriptural perspective. And I think it's wonderful that state schools encourage that. Now, the other threat, of course, is that there are politicians who want to get rid of it. And I would say particularly those of a more progressive ideology regard the idea of scripture being taught, even though it's voluntary, even though, they all say they believe in choice, except they don't want choice on this one. They just want it banned. They don't think the state should be permitting that. And I think that's a real danger and a real threat.
Interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes we talk about a bottleneck, where the bottleneck is, that all children or all students might go through, and that usually is a school setting. So having some Christian religious education, Christian information being relayed, values being shaped, it's the thing that the church has has enabled and needs to keep a hold of. As you say, you need volunteers to do this, and I know that in some communities there's challenges around volunteers, and yet this is like the biggest mission field that you've got. So you don't want to lose it, do you?
No, you don't. And in fact, it's good that we're discussing this just now, because when we are finished, I am going to be getting ready to head off to Hamilton Primary School to teach my first SRE this afternoon. So I am looking forward to it with fear and trepidation. but I did do it down in North Sydney for a while, but this is my first of this particular age group, and it's the first one up here. And I regard it as an absolute honour to do it, and a privilege to be able to do it. And we shall see what happens. I did get a letter from a parent. I went in as a provisional, and I got a letter from a parent saying, there's this Scotsman who owns a church in Hamilton, and who's got an impenetrable accent. And he's meant to be coming to us, which I thought was hilarious. So I wrote the parent back and said, yeah, watch out, I am coming. But my accent is very penetrable, so don't worry. But it's a privilege to be able to do it. And I fear that we don't prioritize this enough. I think that churches need to pray and support for their local schools, and particularly in the SRE. And, I personally think that we should commission volunteers as part of a church, and we should encourage it that way. In other words, we should take it really seriously. I think there are an awful lot of Christians who think, this is a good thing to have. It would be a detrimental thing if it went away, but I ain't going to do anything about it, which kind of reminds me of James saying, you say to your brother, go wish you well, and you have the means to help them, and you don't. So I think we need to, if we don't take it seriously, it will be taken from us. Of that, I'm pretty sure. Take
it seriously and put on your best Australian accent so those kids can understand you. Hey,
good day.
One of the big accusations that I've noted over the years, and I think it's misled, but it's this thought that when you are in SRE, religious instruction in schools, that somehow you're there for proselytising. Now, I'm not sure if you're across any sort of definitions around that word at all, David, but proselytising, in its strictest sense, means encourage someone from another religion to change to your religion. And sometimes Christian religious education or instruction or SRE has been accused of proselytising. Of course, that's not the case at all, because what it is, though, is presenting one side. It's presenting a Christian worldview and Christian argument, Christian shaping for a young life. Any thoughts here around what the accusation might be? Because I don't think it's actually accurate.
Yeah, well, I might disagree with you a little bit, because I might be a little bit controversial on this one. First of all, let me just simply say that it's absolute hypocrisy for the people who are complaining about proselytizing. Because what do you think is going on in our schools at the moment? Our children, for example, are being taught a gender ideology, which is proselytizing. I would argue our children are being brainwashed in many schools, or at least, if not brainwashed, heavily influenced so they accept an ideology which is fundamentally anti-Christian. So there is a lot of proselytism goes on within schools, and a lot of it is done by activist teachers who are putting forward their own particular philosophy, view of faith, or whatever. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing I would say is proselytizing in the sense of seeking to convert someone to your religion who's of another religion, no. But proselytizing in the sense of seeking to persuade people that Jesus Christ is the best way to go, absolutely. I plead guilty all the time, and I will always plead guilty to that. And now, part of my understanding of biblical theology is I can't convert anyone, so I don't try and convert people, but I tell people about Jesus, and if they want to follow him, that's a marvelous thing, if the Spirit works in that way. So I think there's a huge element of hypocrisy in this accusation, a huge element of irrationality, and a reluctance to accept that almost everything that we teach is somehow influenced by our ideology and our worldview. And why shouldn't Christians? These are people who volunteer to come to it. So I would absolutely welcome any Muslim or Hindu or atheist of the atheist faith, and it is a faith. I would welcome, and I hope that they'll come to my SRE, and I would always treat them with respect, but I will also always tell them about Christ.
That old saying is the darkness gets darker, the light gets brighter. All the more when you are standing in front of a class and there might be kids who are peppering you with questions, for you to be able to identify those differences, because there's real contrast. And the contrast is getting brighter every day we spend, every day that goes by. There is a sense, isn't there, that if you are in that opportunity to be able to present to children those Christian elements of faith and those things that will shape them for good citizenship, we might even add to the future, that you shouldn't miss that opportunity, because more and more the contrast is obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that we're doing, so primarily SRE in schools, as far as I can see at the moment, is providing scriptural teaching for children from Christian homes, or at the very least from children from homes whose parents want them to get it. Now, why would anyone object to any of that unless they themselves were arguing for their own proselytism? You know, I mean, I actually think that in many situations, we are the kind of the alternative society. We are the rebels. I mean, one of the interesting things in a more general sense about Australia astounds me. 20% of Australian children are being educated in private schools, the vast majority of which are Christian schools. And, you know, that's a bigger issue. I mean, I think that's where the attack's going to come. I mean, we're talking particularly about SRE within the state schools. I think that's wonderful. But I think the other issue that you and I maybe should discuss one time is the threat to Christian, because that is one area where I would say the kind of, I hate the term progressive, because they're not progressive, they're regressive really. But this return to pagan values, regressing to pagan values, that's one area where the Christian church is saying, no, we're not going there. And I think that's one area that they're determined to remove from us. So we need to stand up for that and defend that. But meanwhile, SRE is a very good way of helping, first of all, and I think the primary reason is to help pupils from a Christian background within a state school system, and secondly, as a public witness within that school.
You've got this push for a regression to pagan values, as I think you rightly identify there, and that particular activist element is calling for the Christian church to be in some ways neutral, sort of a neutral, secularized education. There's a sense, isn't there, in which our Christianity can never be neutral. And if you are trying to be neutral, you're probably moving towards where the woke community wants you to be. Any thoughts here around this sort of idea that somehow Christians need to be neutral in their presentation of some sort of secular education?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's no neutrality. You know, you cannot, in education, you cannot claim that things are neutral. So I would say at a broad level, the worldview that education within the Western world has largely had has been a Christian one. And the primary focus of that has been, you don't teach a child what to think, you teach them how to think. Now, I think what's happening in a lot of Australia's schools at the moment is that many teachers have become social and political activists, and they are teaching children what to think. So I'm reading a book here just now by Ken Goodlett and John Collier. John Collier was the head of St Andrew's Cathedral School in Sydney, and Ken Goodlett was an Australian educator. Both of them, I think, are brilliant. And that wider picture of education, it is very clear you cannot be neutral. You know, how can you be neutral on racism? How can you be neutral on misogyny? How can you be neutral on God? How can you be neutral on what different religions teach? What you can be is tolerant, I would say. What you can be is open to thinking. I think Christian schools are more open and more varied than many of the secular schools which teach one doctrine only.
So when you've got this buffering coming from every direction for our kids and our grandkids who are going through our schooling system, the thought of having SRE or special religious education there, it helps those children, those students, to be able to have a contrast, to be able to explore those questions about faith, and about values and about their own personal beliefs, it gives a really particularly strong starting point while they're going through all of the different changes and the different things that are challenging their beliefs all the way through. So somehow or other, as Christian believers, we have to be in this space and offering the alternative. Otherwise, kids get swept along in the current, don't they? A current of secularization.
Well, absolutely. And then you see the other problem there is people think, and again, this tends to be older people like me, not you, but I tend to think, we tend to think, my generation tend to think, well, we've got church and they've got, family worship and the schools are essentially Christian in ethos. That's no longer true. And therefore, half an hour of Sunday school a week is never going to cut it. So we need to think about how we educate our kids, especially those who are in the state system where it's not neutral, it's invariably hostile to biblical Christianity. So that's where I think, for example, I remember back in my city of Dundee in Scotland, I was astounded to hear that the local Muslims, that they sent their kids off to the state school, and then every day for 2 hours afterwards, they were given Quranic education, and on a Saturday morning. And I thought, well, these guys are taking it seriously. I at least admire them for that. And I think that what we need is some way that I think Christian schools are a great thing, and I hope they will continue. But I also think Christian input into secular education is essential. SRE is part of that. Christian teachers are part of it. But I think a Christian worldview through media as well. I mean, I think that Vision and other Christian radio stations are very much part of it. I think writing is very much part of it. And I think people like me who are clergy, being involved with young people and trying to understand what they're being taught at school and interacting with it, even during sermons, is tremendously important.
So this thought that we need to be particularly resilient in holding the line where you've got the opportunity to have SRE in the classroom, embrace that. And where you've got the opportunity to bring any sort of shaping of values to those young people in whatever setting that you've got. And as we mentioned, a state like Victoria, where it was taken out of the classroom and relinquished into the lunch break or after school, but to take the opportunities wherever possible. A Christian social commentator, David Robertson, you can connect with David, and undoubtedly, since he's about to start teaching SRE, he'll be writing about this in the times to come. You might want to keep up with some of the insightful blog articles he writes. You can do that at theweeflea.com, theweeflea.com. And his latest book is called Seek, a number of earlier books too, and David, renowned for writing newspaper, magazine articles. He's written a number of books too, The Dawkins Letters and Engaging with Atheists. You can connect with David at theweeflea.com. David, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us once again today on 2020.
Well, it's great being with you. So I'm off to see my kids and to teach these Australian kids how to speak proper English with a Scottish accent. That will be the success of SRE.
God's richest blessing on you, Dave.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.